Thank you. We are going to be recording this session, as you just noticed, so that it is a resource available for those who aren't able to join us today. Um, we are excited to have everyone here. Uh, this is officially a webinar, but towards the end, I am happy to unmute everyone so that if you would like, you could raise your hand and ask a question live, or we also do have the Q&A box. We would love for you, as the information is shared, to put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the session so that we can have plenty of time at the end to look through and answer your questions. I think that is probably it for the basic information. I think we're all very familiar now at this point with how these sessions work. So I'd love to be able to pass it on to our Associate Director, Tara Chu, to give a little introduction to this session. Please, Tara.
Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. And thanks so much to all our speakers for being here, especially Emilia at 2 in the morning, but to all our speakers. So let me start. Apologies, I'm having a quick screen sharing issue. Let me start by discussing how we got here. So earlier this year, the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Markets, Risk and Resilience launched a series of events on insights from behavioral economics on factors that make standard developmental programs surprisingly effective or sometimes surprisingly ineffective. The first event introduced three areas of work and insight: limited attention and complexity, decision making in the face of risk and uncertainty, and aspirations, agency, and mental health. Today, we're taking a deeper dive into recent learnings from the lab on enabling the adoption of improved technologies that promise smallholder farmers improved livelihoods. Our speakers today will be weaving together insights from all three of these areas to consider ways in which psychological attitudes and soil heterogeneity can pose barriers to learning about new agricultural technologies, and then also how new digital technologies might help overcome some of those barriers. So our three speakers today are across three different topics. The first being The Farmer and the Fates from Jonathan Malacarne at University of Maine. Evidence from a recent randomized controlled trial of improved maize varieties in Mozambique shows how deep-seated beliefs over our ability to control our own fates shapes technology adoption and even our willingness to try to learn. The second, Learning from Others in Heterogeneous Environments from Emilia Tjernström at Monash University. While farmers often learn most effectively from each other, naturally occurring heterogeneity in soil quality and other factors can block this important avenue of learning and slow the adoption of new technologies, as shown in this RCT exploring the adoption of new seed varieties in Western Kenya. Our third and final speaker is speaking to adapting and learning about financial technologies to manage risk, Andrew Hobbs, University of San Francisco. So when high quality index insurance products are designed with links to what are traditionally male controlled livelihoods like livestock, the product may not be appealing to women. But RCTs from Northern Kenya show how to overcome this limitation and make insurance also speak to women who are the ones that bear much of the risk in agricultural households. In addition, insurance is a tool that can take years to reveal its product's qualities or lack of quality. So this research demonstrates also how you can use digital technology tools, digital teaching tools, to allow livestock keepers to quickly learn about the complexities of index insurance. With that, I will go ahead and let our speakers begin. So I'll pass to you, Jonathan.
Great, thank you very much. Let me get my slides up here. Can everybody see my slides okay? I get a thumbs up from somebody in though. Great. Well, perfect. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm particularly excited to be presenting with Emilia and Andrew, whose work has been very influential in some of the ideas that I'll talk about and some of my current work. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to set the stage for some of the challenges that exist when we're promoting resilience enhancing technologies. And then I'll pass it off to Andrew and to Emilia, who will help us understand a little bit more how we can maybe solve some of those. So once again, my name is Jonathan Malacarne. I am an agricultural economist at the University of Maine in the School of Economics, and I'm also faculty with the Maine Agriculture and Forestry Experiment Station. And I'm going to call this work The Farmer and the Fates. I've been calling it that for a long time. And the goal is really to understand how we attribute influence to our own actions and to things outside of our control. Whenever I was preparing for this talk, I was also grading the midterm for my undergraduate mathematical economics class. And I realized that this question was on my midterm, and it's actually kind of core to the work that I'm going to talk about here today too. So I asked students, true or false, and if false, they had to tell me why. And the statement was, a student who wants to get a good grade on an exam should always study as many hours as possible. They all told me, of course, because they are great students and get all of my questions correct, that this statement is false. And it's false because we need a few additional assumptions in order for it to be true. First, we would have to assume that the student wanted to get as high a grade as possible. And then second, we would have to assume that more studying, more effort on the part of the student translated to a higher grade. And not only was that objectively true, but that students knew that and used that to make their decisions. These are actually really interesting assumptions whenever we're studying resilience enhancing technologies and agriculture, because it's a space where our own decisions, our own actions, and forces outside of our control interact very strongly to determine outcomes. So the formal concept on which this work is based comes out of social psychology, and it's called locus of control. Locus of control just refers to the extent to which a decision maker believes that her actions influence outcomes relative to forces outside of her own control. And then that belief we can locate on a spectrum between the poles of internal control, where your own outcomes are the primary driving factor, and external control, where forces outside of your control are what primarily influence outcomes. For the last almost 10 years now, with the support of the MRR Innovation Lab, I've been working on a variety of teams to study resilience-enhancing technologies, and in particular, drought-tolerant maize varieties and satellite-based index insurance on farmer well-being in Mozambique and Tanzania. And this is, as I think I mentioned, a really interesting avenue to think about control of outcomes and farmer beliefs about control of outcomes, because we believe choice of inputs matters, and that is something that is under the farmer's own control, and weather outcomes matter. And one of the particular challenges of these technologies is that their biggest benefit is going to exist for the most vulnerable households. But at the same time, those households, through their lived experience, have faced many shocks outside of their control, from drought, from economic circumstance, from geography, from many other things. And it is entirely possible that facing those shocks has left individuals feeling like what they do doesn't matter. And so, if what you do doesn't matter, why would you dedicate scarce resources to investing in a process like rain-fed maize? In order to study this, we develop an instrument for measuring locus of control or estimating locus of control specific to maize and specific to growing maize. And the way that we do that is we ask farmers to imagine a variety of scenarios. Using their best maize plot as a reference point, and we ask them to imagine what harvest they would obtain if they use a variety of different input bundles, so we vary the thing under their control, and facing a variety of different weather outcomes. We'll then look at the variation in harvest outcomes that's attributable to factors outside of farmer control and compare that to the fraction of variation in harvest outcomes that results from the thing that they can control. We can look at a few actual farmer examples to see how those two show up differently. So these two panels on the left and the right are taking that conceptual map and applying actual farmer data to it. The figure on the left is from a farmer who demonstrates strong internal control. We can see internal control in this figure because a lot of the variation comes across lines, compared to the picture on the right, which demonstrates strong external control, so a higher number in our little locus of control variable. And here, most of the variation is attributable to kind of horizontal travel on those lines, moving across weather states rather than moving across the thing that farmers control. So does this matter in our context and this context of resilience enhancing technologies? We find that it really does. So external control in maize production was associated with a 13% reduction in the effect of our promotion of drought-tolerant maize varieties. So we ran a multi-year randomized control trial in these two countries where we intensively promoted these technologies. Our efforts were successful in general at increasing use of this new technology, but they were much less successful for households that didn't believe that what they did matters in maize production. We also find that one of the reasons for that is likely that external control was also associated with a reduction in the expected yield return from using improved varieties over local varieties. And it was fairly sizable, almost half a standard deviation. To talk a little bit more about what that means, here I've plotted maize-specific locus of control on the x-axis. Larger numbers are more external control, so believing that a higher fraction of the variation comes from the weather rather than your choice of inputs. And then on the right-hand side y-axis, we have the expected yield return from using an additional kilogram of improved seed over an additional kilogram of local saved seed. And we can see that as maize-specific locus of control becomes more external, the expected yield return plummets pretty significantly. So these vertical lines show the terciles of the maize-specific locus of control distribution. And where that really starts to matter is indicated by these horizontal dashed lines, which show the break-even expected return for hybrid improved seeds and open pollinated improved seeds. So if you hold the belief that the expected yield return is below the dashed line for hybrid seeds, that means it's not cost effective for you, or you believe that it's not cost effective for you to adopt these seeds. And if we look at the internal side, or the side of the distribution where people hold more internal beliefs, they believe that adopting improved seeds is has a high return to them, and a return that very much exceeds that break-even point. As beliefs come more external, we start to get in a much more tenuous position with regard to this economic benefit. To think about why that's particularly concerning to us and concerning for this technology, here I summarize some of our results about the impacts of adopting drought-tolerant maize and satellite-based index insurance on harvest outcomes. So on an outcome, not just on adoption. And what we find is that these technologies are actually really helpful for households. They help households mitigate the shocks that they were designed to deal with. Drought-tolerant maize completely offsets the within-season effects of experiencing a moderate drought, and it also keeps those effects from spilling over into the next season. Index insurance more than offsets these effects, so it allows households to deepen their investment and recover after bad things happen. But we have to ask ourselves the question of who's driving these effects and who's getting the benefits of these effects. Right? We've shown that households that are more vulnerable and whose vulnerability has left them feeling that what they do doesn't matter were less likely to adopt these technologies in the first place. Right? So we're probably not getting as big of an impact as we could because we're not managing to reach households that have been conditioned to believe that what they do doesn't matter. Right? One of the other challenges of believing that what you do doesn't matter is it makes it really easy to attribute whatever you see to forces outside of your control. So if we were to go around and we were to just give people the opportunity to experiment, then if you believe that what you do doesn't matter and that outcomes are completely determined by random forces, then if you get a great harvest outcome, okay, well, it wasn't really what you did that drove it, so why should you risk your resources? And if you get a bad harvest outcome, well, that's just how it goes. Right? Learning is complicated additionally by not being able to take credit for what happens. So before I pass it off, I just wanted to summarize real quick what I think that means. So I've continued to work in Mozambique partly because our private sector partners have seen a lot of benefit and potential in these technologies. And so they have stepped up their branding and stepped up their promotion. There's now a commercially available version of the drought-tolerant maize and index insurance bundle that we were studying called Clima Seguro that's available in Mozambique. And so what we've done is say, okay, that's great. We know this technology can work. How do we promote it effectively? How do we subsidize the learning process, particularly with an eye to these households that are most vulnerable and might not believe that their actions are going to translate to better outcomes for themselves? From the policy side, I think we really need to ask ourselves, if we want to maximize programmatic and policy impacts of resilience-enhancing technologies, how can we better take into account the lived experience of households and the beliefs that has left them with, and what does that mean for the way that we promote those technologies and provide households opportunities to learn? So this is going to be my bridge as I pass it off to Emilia. I have created some problems. The problems are we develop wonderful technologies that we believe help people, and the evidence shows help people, but they need to learn about those benefits. And particularly the households that are the most vulnerable needs to be given support in learning about those benefits. And I'm hoping that Emilia and Andrew can paint us a little bit of a rosier picture about how we might be able to further that learning process along. So thank you, and I'll pass it off here to Emilia.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to replace your slides with mine. And if I stumble over words, please forgive me. It is 2 a.m. So that's going to be my excuse. Hopefully I won't. So thanks all for being here. It's really a pleasure to share some of my work with all of you. Let's see, sorry, I just lost my slides. There we go. I'm Emilia Tjernström. I'm a senior research fellow at Monash University here in Australia. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to jump right in. As we all know, developing country markets and institutions are often imperfect or even missing, right? And in some cases, social networks can help fill key gaps. I have a few examples here, but the one that I'll focus on is that in the presence of information frictions, social networks can improve the diffusion of information, for example, about new technologies, right? And that's the aspect of networks that I'm going to focus on in this talk. When this works well, it's something that we can leverage in development programming to get a better bang for our buck, right? So we don't have to introduce a new technology to every potential beneficiary. We can sort of rely on social networks to do some of that work for us. Now, when we do this, we typically want to achieve more than just information diffusion, right? When we're thinking about technology adoption, we usually want to induce social learning, which is kind of a higher bar than information diffusion. And so in order for people to learn about new technologies through social networks, we could say that two basic things have to happen, right? First, the network has to spread the information. And so that's just information diffusion. And then secondly, the recipients of the information have to be able to aggregate the information in a useful way into knowledge or beliefs. So for example, we might want them to update their beliefs about the returns to adopting a technology. Right? So in Jonathan's case, that was index insurance and drought-tolerant maize. Could be many different things. Now, unfortunately, there's quite a few cases where social networks don't do their job so well, right? This could be either that information inequalities or inequalities arise due to differential connectedness within the network. So for example, certain people or certain groups may be less connected. So women farmers may be less connected in the network than male farmers, and then they might miss out on valuable information if we rely on networks to spread it. It can also really matter where in the network you introduce information. So targeting more centrally located individuals has been shown to lead to much more efficient diffusion of information. Now, there's also a number of potential biases that could limit how well people are able to aggregate information once they receive it. So for example, I might fail to account for repetition in the information that I receive. Say I receive the same piece of information multiple times. If that stems from the same source, I might still be giving it more weight because I'm sort of missing out or not fully taking into account the fact that it's coming from that same source, but I heard it multiple times, so I'm going to give it more weight. And then the part that I'm going to focus on is when benefits to a technology are heterogeneous. Okay, so I want to zoom in a little bit on why heterogeneity in the benefits or returns to a technology might limit social learning. And some of these limitations are more in the realm of behavioral economics than others, but it can be really hard to know which of these is actually causing the limitations in the social network's ability to spread information. So one example of a limitation is that when returns are very heterogeneous, I might struggle to aggregate the information that I receive through my network for a variety of reasons. But for example, I might overestimate or underestimate the technology's potential for my own use because I observe really mixed outcomes among my peers, right? And this can further be exacerbated by cognitive biases because they might influence, who I pay attention to, right? There's some evidence that people tend to give more weight to good news. And then I might overestimate the potential of technology for me. In addition, if several of my neighbors try new technology, but they get really different outcomes, right? That might make me think that the returns to this technology are really uncertain, right? And we all know that uncertainty tends to reduce adoption of new technologies. And for those of you who attended the original Behavioral Economics Forum, you'll know everything about ambiguity aversion, right? Which can greatly amplify this. So for example, if I am a farmer and I don't know what's driving the differences in returns that I observe among my neighbors, then it makes it hard for me to determine whether the variability that I observe is reflecting systematic factors like this guy's a better farmer than this other guy, and so adopter characteristics are driving the heterogeneity in outcomes, or maybe it's just randomness, right? So the less I can determine that, the less I can sort of try to tease out those factors, the harder it's going to be for me to figure out what the probability distributions look like. And that sounds a lot like ambiguity, and that can really reduce adoption, okay? So how big of an issue is this? Well, for an example, let's take a look at soil heterogeneity, and we're going to be looking at Kenya and hybrid maize seed adoption. A key thing driving returns to hybrids and to several other improved agriculture technologies is soil quality or soil fertility. This graph here is showing us the cation exchange capacity, or CEC, plotted across 107 different villages sampled from 1,800 farmers' fields, okay? Just looking at this, I think it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of heterogeneity across these villages. And so if you take a look at each bar in this graph is representing one village. And the height of each bar basically reflects the amount of variability in CEC within that village, okay? So you can think of CEC as broadly writ, sort of describing soil fertility. So higher CEC values mean that the soil can retain more essential nutrients, making them more available to plants. And this can have a positive effect on the returns to hybrid maize seeds because hybrids are more sensitive to nutrients, to nutrient availability, okay? So looking at this then, if you look at two villages that are right next to each other, so which means that they have similar median levels of CEC, but really different variability potentially, right? If you compare one village that has a short bar, that means that the person with the highest CEC in that village and the person with the lowest CEC in that village have really quite similar CECs compared to the village next to them where the highest CEC is very, very different from the lowest CEC. So that reflects that sort of the heterogeneity that we're going to exploit. And so we're going to look at whether CEC variability in a village impacts people's ability to learn or to socially learn, right? To learn from their neighbors. So I combine a large-scale RCT where we randomly selected farmers to receive samples of hybrid maize seeds. And this is a new hybrid maize variety. They got little 250-gram packets that they could experiment with. Then I laid on top of that social network surveys where we interviewed both treated farmers and untreated farmers and asked them questions like, who do you talk to about agriculture? Who's in your farmers group? Who's in your microfinance group? And based on that, we map out the network and study the number of treated farmers in the network. And I can look at both the experiences of the treated farmers and the rate and effectiveness of social learning. And so the key takeaways are that farmers talk to each other, which is surprising to no one except maybe economists. But that's true across all villages, irrespective of their soil quality similarity. Okay. Now, what would we expect? In the context where social learning works, we would expect an untreated farmer who knows lots of treated farmers, especially if those treated farmers had a good experience with a hybrid. We would expect this untreated farmer to be more likely to go out and purchase this hybrid and try it for themselves, right? And that's exactly what we find in villages where soil quality is relatively homogeneous. By contrast, in more heterogeneous villages, these network effects are basically absent. So what does this mean for development programming and for our ability to leverage social networks? Well, so my takeaway is that the more heterogeneous the returns, the less we can rely on social networks, and we instead need to allow for people to experiment with the technology themselves. That can take different forms. We might need to encourage or subsidize individual learning, like Jonathan was just talking about. And so in my last sort of minute, I want to talk about an example of a case where one way that one can facilitate learning and take heterogeneity really seriously. And so this is a paper called Learning by Virtually Doing, where we took soil samples. You can probably tell I like soil samples. And we built a crop model and simulated the returns or the yields under lots of different combinations of fertilizers and other inputs. And we let farmers experiment with what was essentially a virtual representation of their own field. And what we find in 1 minute or less is that farmers change their adoption behavior in response to the app. So they're able to experiment basically cost-free. And the effect of this interaction is really concentrated among those farmers who we predicted would have the highest returns to adopting a new technology, right? So they are the ones who we basically gave a small allocation of funds to experiment with prior to interacting with the app. And we allowed them to reallocate those funds at the end of the experimentation. And we see that basically nobody adopts the new technology at baseline. And after interacting with the app, those who we had predicted ex ante would have the highest returns are the ones who shift their behavior the most towards adopting this technology. And so this is a context where social learning may not be optimal because the underlying heterogeneity is so important. And so I think, to me, the key takeaway is that in those contexts, we really need to take heterogeneity seriously and think about how we can best encourage learning for the technology that we are interested in. And I'm really happy to take any questions, and I'd like to thank you for your time. We're going to listen to Andrew now. He's going to talk more about learning and virtual learning in a very different context, but I think it also highlights a nice aspect of heterogeneity, just a very different one. So yeah, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Emilia. As Emilia said, I'm going to be building on what, or at least linking to what she just laid out in terms of learning by virtually doing. And in terms of a sort of a different type of heterogeneity, which is the heterogeneity in the way in which shocks can affect folks of different genders. So as you can tell from the title here, I'm going to be talking about insurance. And my name is Andrew Hobbs. I'm a assistant professor at the University of San Francisco in the economics department. So like the technologies, like many farm technologies, insurance is something that farmers have a hard time predicting the benefits of before they adopt it. And even compared to other financial technologies, it's especially confusing and complicated. That's even more true for index insurance. So index-based insurance, for those of you that don't already know, is a type of insurance that pays policyholders out based on a regional index of hazard conditions. So in the case of drought, which is what we were studying in the context that I'll be talking about here, we have a satellite-based index that determines whether there's a drought. And if there was a drought, then everyone in the area who has a contract gets paid out. And so that's actually a pretty complicated and unintuitive financial product for people who aren't used to it. And so I'm going to be talking about a novel way that we tried some years ago to inform people about it. And then I'm going to talk about how we adapted that information to different genders. In particular, we adapted it by changing the way the benefits of the insurance were framed. So as you all probably know, agricultural insurance has the big benefit of supplementing your income when your crop yields fail. But you can think about that in a few different ways. One, you can think about it as offsetting your agricultural losses. Another way to think about it is it helps you prevent having to cut your household consumption or cut your expenditures. And those, it turns out, can have those different ways of framing the benefits can have pretty different impacts on uptake. So I'm going to speak very briefly about two different studies here, but they both took place in Samburu County, Kenya, and they were both linked to a larger randomized controlled trial that took place from between 2018 and 2022. So Samburu County is in the northern part of Kenya. It's a dry environment, and most of the population are nomadic pastoralists. And so they're migratory, and they rely almost exclusively on livestock for their income. That means when there's a drought that affects the forage for the livestock, household consumption takes a big hit, because almost none of these families have any other form of income. And in the cases where they do, because the whole local economy is negatively affected by droughts, those other sources of income, which might be like a kiosk business that someone's running out of their house, or a livestock fattening business that they're running out of their house, also suffer. So the first study I'm going to talk about links closely to what Emilia was talking about, in that it is learning by simulated doing, we call it. So what we did is we developed a tablet-based video game that simulates the experience of having index-based insurance. And the benefit of this is you can experience numerous years in a short session. Whereas to learn about insurance in the real world, as a farmer, you have to wait several seasons. And because of the nature of insurance, it doesn't always pay out. So you don't know whether it's going to work and what it's going to do until it does. And in that study, we also experimented with this novel framing, where we tweaked the way that we explained the insurance, in some cases to focus on the benefits for offsetting livestock losses, and in other cases to focus on its ability to smooth household consumption. And then I'll briefly talk about a real-world follow-up we did to this that essentially showed that the finding with respect to the framing carries through in the real world as well. So I'm going to show you the video game we developed here, because I think in many cases, the easiest way to explain it is to show you. So this is the home screen of the video game. You can see that you can buy goats. So now the player is buying some goats. You can see the wallet balance going down as the goats are getting bought, and then you can see them buying insurance, which is represented by these little shields here in the upper right of the screen. You then make a choice of whether to send your kid to school. So we wanted to simulate sort of like a household decision that wasn't directly related to livestock as well. Once you make your final decision, we see time pass, which is represented by the clouds flowing over, and then you see it rain. So it was not a drought in this case. After the rain, it tells you it was a good year. It tells you how much milk your goats produced and how many babies they had. And it also tells you the insurance payout and links that to the average losses in the region. So that's to help you understand that the payout is based on the average in the region, not on your own personal experience. And just like real index insurance, individual experiences are not necessarily exactly the same as the average in the region. And so that helps folks understand that sometimes index insurance doesn't perfectly correlate with your losses. You can see here, it makes sure that you have enough cash to buy things. This person had to sell a couple goats in order to pay school fees, make their final decision again, and we see time passing yet again with the clouds moving across the screen. This time, as you can tell, it doesn't seem to be raining, so we'll see. But no, it was a drought. And so 7 goats were lost and 10 were insured. So it tells you that the average person in the region would have lost half of their goats, which means that the payout is the value of half the goats. And so this person then got an insurance payout. And in a session of playing this game, so that's all I'm going to show you for now, but you can see that you do this for many, many rounds. People got to experience multiple years with the insurance, and they were able to experiment with buying the insurance or not buying the insurance and see how that affected their outcomes in the game. Now, so that's the learning by simulated doing. And we found, and we have a separate paper where we find that that actually improves scores on a little quiz that we gave folks about understanding insurance. So we do know that it helps them understand insurance, and it's correlated with insurance uptake. In addition to that, we had two different types of sessions. One was targeted at focusing the benefits of insurance on household consumption. And so in that session, we emphasized the fact that despite the fact that livestock are considered a man's asset in this context, the negative effects of losing those livestock affect the entire household because the household needs to cut consumption to pay for those expenditures. And the hypothesis was that this might make insurance more appealing to women who were the main respondents to our survey and were the targets of the larger RCT that this was part of. So we developed a new family insurance product, and we did this both in the video game and in real life. So I'm kind of going to explain both at once right now, just for the sake of time, but I'm happy to talk about the two different studies later in the Q&A if folks have any questions. So we made a couple changes. First, we replaced livestock units in the insurance with family units. So in the traditional insurance, the main decision is how many livestock do you want to insure? And you can say, I want to insure 4 goats and 3 cows, or 2 camels and 2 sheep and 1 goat, or whatever number of animals you want. With the family insurance, we kept that, so you can still insure livestock, but we said you can also insure the consumption of some number of family members. And so we took figures from the Kenya Hunger Safety Net program to estimate how much it costs to support a family member through a drought. And we calibrated the insurance unit so that if you insure one family member, it's meant to pay for that person's share of household expenses in a drought. So you could choose to insure your entire family or just some people in your family as you like. We also developed these new marketing materials. So that's what these comics off to the right are, that were designed to help people understand the new insurance. So you can see these panels. So this is just part of the comic, but she says, I have more good news for you. You can now buy IBLT for families, which is index-based livestock takaful, which is a word for the Sharia compliant insurance product that we had there, to protect your family or even your business. And then she says, so how does it work? You decide how many of IBLT for families you want to buy. In a very severe drought, it will pay up to 5,600 shillings for every unit purchased. So for the simulated version of this study, we saw pretty different effects for women and men. We saw the family insurance more popular among women, and the livestock insurance more popular among men, as measured by the amount they bought. In the game, most people bought at least some insurance, which is different from in the real world, where insurance uptake was more limited. And so there we focus more on, do you buy insurance or not? In the game, we focused on the amount. And so people bought somewhat more insurance, or women bought somewhat more insurance under the family framing, and men bought somewhat more insurance under the livestock framing. In the real world, we weren't able to separate women and men because it's the household making the decision to buy the insurance. And so we can't tell why we see this effect. But similarly, we saw that folks who received the family framing, or households that received this family framing, which was delivered by trusted community mentors that were part of a poverty graduation program in the region, also bought more insurance after the insurance subsidies ended. So once we started the randomized framing, the key thing to focus on in this graphic is the very last 2 bars. You can see that folks in the who received the family framing bought more insurance than those who did not. Interestingly, in this study, the effects were concentrated among people who had previously received insurance coupons. So by the time we did this, those insurance coupons were no longer valid. But an interesting sort of wrinkle of these findings is it seems like it took the combination of previously receiving a subsidy coupon, which gave them some experience with the insurance, and then receiving the different framing for them to buy it. As you can see here, these first 2 bars in the first two bars of the last four show that the people who didn't previously receive a coupon bought almost no insurance, essentially. And so it's not only that there was no difference, it's that nobody in either group really bought insurance at the end of the study. Okay, so I'll conclude with that and look forward to questions from you all. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew, Emilia, and Jonathan. Really appreciate those presentations. So we do have about 15 minutes now to jump into some questions. I know a few came through on the chat, so I would love to be able to jump into that. Let's see here. Okay, so I do have a question here around, so Emilia, you already answered one, I think. So we'll jump into maybe Jonathan, could you talk a little bit more about how you measured the locus of control and whether there were issues around that variable? Because I think, theoretically it's a fascinating way of looking at things like how empowered am I? How does that impact, my choices? But, in nitty gritty, like, how do we do it?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And we actually measured a few different versions of locus of control. We used an instrument out of social psychology called the Levinson IPC scales to measure what we call general locus of control. So your beliefs about your ability to affect outcomes in life broadly. And then in addition, we developed the maze specific instrument that I talked a little bit about. And I think along with this webinar, one of my papers, also called The Farmer and the Fates, will be linked. If you look in the appendix of that paper, there is exhaustive detail on the construction and calibration of both of those instruments. We did things like kind of test-retest analysis to understand kind of how well they held up over time or over short periods of time for an individual. We studied how they changed over the 3 or 4 years of the study. And they hold up pretty well. So they're a little bit noisy, but kind of the fundamental core of the control belief for households is a pretty slow thing to move. And so we think we capture that pretty well in kind of both generally and in maze. I saw a question in here about whether or not use of a single input like DT maze results in a transfer of locus of control from external to internal. And that's actually another really good question that relates to this, right? So all of the evidence that we have on the effects of drought-tolerant maize on harvest across weather outcomes from our study, from other work, Laura Paul has a great paper in the European Review of Agricultural Economics that looks at how well DT works on field trials and on households at mitigating drought. All of that evidence indicates that using drought-tolerant maize objectively shifts control to internal. Whether or not it results, that shows up in locus of control, individual locus of control beliefs about households' kind of own thoughts about their ability to control outcomes is a little bit of a longer term question. And I would love to know, or I would love to study how long one has to use a technology like this before your beliefs actually start to shift and before we can pick up those changes. So we don't really know there, but we do know that they're kind of slow to change.
Yeah, great, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, you just grabbed mine and one of the remaining questions, so that's wonderful. So Emilia and Andrew, since you both kind of jumped into the digital world of learning, kind of are there any learnings around how users kind of accept the simulations as representations of their own lives? I mean, did you kind of, it can be, I think, for some quite a jump to be able to make that connection between what they see on their farm each day and what they're seeing on a small, tablet. So do you have any kind of suggestions or takeaways from that experience?
Yeah, I can start maybe. We did a few things. So first of all, the farmers all, of course, remembered us coming to take soil samples from their fields, right? So they knew that we had we had done our homework, right? Now, of course, there's still a big leap to believing the simulations. But just very practically, we did a few things, like farmers could select the color of the soil of the field in the app to look more like theirs. We also did a few tests at the beginning. So we said, how big is your field? What do you get in a normal year? So we let them run sort of a simulation that reflected what they normally do, so that they could see whether the levels that the app predicted reflected their reality, if that makes sense. So that allowed them to sort of judge a bit the quality of the simulations. But in general, yeah, the fact that they actually used, they changed their allocation of a budget, and we then actually provided them with the fertilizers and the inputs that they chose. So it was incentive compatible. The fact that their behavior changed, to me, already signals that there was a fair bit of buy-in, right? But I think, of course, it's a great point. It's always the challenge with these kinds of tools. But I think if we think about the benefits of being able to experiment over many, virtual seasons, I think that's really where learning, for farmers who farm a single crop or multiple crops over, even if you've been farming for 30 years, the number of observations that you have for any combination of inputs and weather and choices is really very few and not really enough to make solid statistical inference. And so being able to flesh that space out more with virtual learning, I think, is a really exciting possibility. I'll pass it to Andrew. I'm sure you have lots as well to say.
Yeah, thanks. So similarly to what Emilia said, I think it was important that we had spent time in that context before. And in particular, I developed this app with the help of a bunch of the enumerators who were part of our survey in the region, and they were all from that area, and so they'd all grown up as pastoralists as well. And so we went through lots and lots of versions of the app, and they changed a lot of things that I had gotten wrong in the first round to make it match their reality better. I remember, for example, they thought it was ridiculous that I had initially made it so that the milk and the number of goats that were born were not related, and they were both randomly generated. But they noticed a few times that you could have like more milk with less baby goats, and they were like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you have to, this needs to reflect reality. And also the probabilities we tweaked to fit the environment, and we you saw the background picture was actually from Samburu County. And so I think all those things helped people feel like it represented their real life. I think different from Emilia's, it wasn't supposed to be like a perfect representation of their specific existence, but they did comment a lot in the sessions that like, oh, this is what our decisions are actually like. Oh, and one other thing that we did that I think was important is we chose goats as opposed to other livestock because we wanted both women and men to find it relevant to them. And that's one animal that they are both relatively more equally responsible for compared to cows or camels, which are especially sort of male gendered. So I think, in short, spending time with the people who you want to use the app and sort of doing user experience testing is really important.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. So in our last kind of 8 minutes or so, I'd love to do kind of a final round robin between the three of you. We have in attendance many people who are kind of program implementers. So they're interested in, not just the research and the findings that you're presenting today, but also kind of the implications for what that might mean for their programming. So, how do the findings that you are uncovering, how could they potentially impact the design of a program that's set to either increase technology adoption or reduce vulnerability of a pastoralist region? So I know sometimes it's a little bit of a stretch for economists to kind of make that jump into policy and programming recommendations, but if you have some kind of last takeaways that you'd really like to share with this audience in terms of, if they're sitting there thinking about how do I make this program better, what might they want to consider as a takeaway from your learnings? Thank you.
Let's stick to the order.
Yeah. So Jonathan, Emilia,
Andrew. Okay. Yeah. So I feel like this set of people is maybe a little bit more readily willing to answer this question than some other economists, because I know Andrew and Emilia quite well, and we all have spent years of our time out trying to promote these technologies and understanding how the households that they're designed to serve kind of interact with them and understand them. And one of the threads across the three presentations that I heard and that kind of really shapes my approach is this was actually my reason for showing the exam question as well, is that I think all too often as program designers and implementers assume that the people we're designing the technologies for understand them and see them in the same way that we do. And we undervalue the lived experience of the households that our technologies are designed for. And by undervaluing that experience, we really kind of miss the boat, and we set ourselves up to start from not a very tenable position. And it was great to hear. Actually, I demoed Emilia's game for her whenever she was designing it. We were both in the field, and to hear Andrew talk about the back and forth with his enumeration team, like all of those things are about kind of more firmly embedding the lived experience of the households that we want to be served by these technologies into their design and into their promotion. And that's really hard, especially whenever we're pushed to get high adoption numbers, or we're to get broad adoption numbers. And sometimes they're cross purposes. To get the most households to adopt, we're not always getting them into the hands that can benefit the most, who might be harder to reach. And so yeah, so that's my broad takeaway, is that for me, it's all about making sure that we are giving value and giving space to the perspectives and lived experience of the households we're trying to serve.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. And you essentially said, you already said heterogeneity, without that sort of explicitly flagging it. But I think, to my mind, and this is something that economists are getting a lot better at, I think, is thinking beyond average treatment effects. And a lot of my work is focused on this across different technologies and across different domains, is really thinking about how heterogeneity shapes optimal policy. And I think as I think in the policy space, in the practitioner space, we do often see a bit, a tendency for not reductionist thinking, but for sort of picking a number, right? And saying, well, we know that this technology increases yields by 20%. And everyone fundamentally knows that 20% isn't true for anyone, right? It's an average. But thinking carefully about when it's relevant, which I have a tendency to think is most of the time, heterogeneity is always present, and paying careful attention to it, especially when we want to leverage networks to spread information about technologies, I think is really crucial. And thinking carefully about how to best inform people about the underlying heterogeneity that might exist. It can also, I think, really help reduce sort of disappointment, right? When extension agents come in, or whoever it is that's trying to diffuse some technology or inform people about its existence, it's easy to just rely on the single number because it's there, and it sort of might be what field trials showed. But helping people understand and grapple a bit with who it might work well for, I think, can really get us much further, because telling someone that they should expect 20% might lead them to be disappointed if they get 10%, even though that's actually, that's still a pretty big increase in yields. And so paying careful attention to it, repeating myself here a bit, but it's something that I think we can all do better. But I think we are developing a lot of great tools, both for estimating heterogeneity and treatment effects, but also for, ultimately taking that into practice and building it into how we inform people about technologies. So I hope that was coherent. I'm not sure. It's a bit
That was great. Thank you, Emilia. Andrew, some last words, some takeaways.
Yeah, I'll just make two quick points. So the first one is that I think that games are fun and they get people's attention and they make them pay attention to things and learn about them. I did another experiment with the game recently and it was similarly a big success. People love it, they pay attention, and I think they learn from it. And that's even true for some people who we've worried about having trouble with it, like older folks who haven't like interacted very much with these kinds of digital devices. So I recommend trying them if you want to teach folks, especially about some kind of complicated technology that they haven't tried. And then the second one is that framing matters. And so I think sometimes economists might forget more than other people about this, but the way that you explain the benefits of a product to somebody can make a big difference. And so it's important to think about linking the benefits that you emphasize to the risks or the needs that they have in order to make it appealing to folks. And I'll just stop there since I know we're pretty much out of time.
Great, fabulous. Wonderful points to end off on. Hopefully, our audience has absorbed some of this great information. We do have on our website, basis.ucdavis.edu, a whole landing page that has information from this entire series of events, both the in-person event information back from February, and then also this webinar series, including papers that our panelists mentioned, and the recording will be found there as well. We do have a last webinar in this series coming at the end of January 23rd. So be on the lookout via LinkedIn or our newsletter for more information about that session. We will be focusing on aspirations and kind of iniquity in that session, which will be another interesting look at kind of the combination of economics and psychology in these kinds of programming decisions. So we are very excited to continue this session, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, or in the case of Emilia, get back to bed. So thank you very much, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
guys.